Imagine one of the most powerful rulers in the medieval world, a monarch feared by enemies, respected by allies, and celebrated for his military brilliance across Europe. Frederick I, better known as Frederick Barbarossa, spent decades leading armies, crushing rebellions, expanding his authority, and shaping the future of the Holy Roman Empire. He survived countless battles, political intrigues, and the constant dangers that accompanied life as a medieval ruler. Yet the event that ended his extraordinary life was neither a battlefield defeat nor an assassin's blade. In June 1190, while leading a massive crusading army toward the Holy Land during the Third Crusade, Barbarossa met a fate so unexpected that it continues to fascinate historians today. While crossing a river in Anatolia, he drowned in water reportedly shallow enough for most men to stand in. The sudden death of the emperor sent shockwaves through his army and across Christendom. An immense crusading force that had marched thousands of miles lost its leader in an instant, morale collapsed, and the momentum of one of the largest crusades ever assembled began to unravel. More than 8 centuries later, historians still debate exactly what happened on that fateful day. How could one of the greatest rulers of the Middle Ages perish in such an ordinary setting? And how different might history have been had Frederick Barbarossa survived to complete his journey to the Holy Land? This is the extraordinary story of a ruler whose death changed the course of history. Long before the mysterious accident that would end his life and alter the course of the Third Crusade, Frederick Barbarossa had already established himself as one of the most formidable rulers in medieval Europe. Born around 1122 into the powerful Hohenstaufen dynasty, Frederick entered a world defined by political fragmentation, shifting alliances, and constant competition among ambitious nobles. Europe in the 12th century was not a collection of unified nations, but a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, principalities, bishoprics, and city-states, each pursuing its own interests. Power was often determined not only by inheritance, but also by military strength, political skill, and the ability to command loyalty in an era where rebellion was a constant threat. From an early age, Frederick was exposed to the complexities of noble politics and imperial governance. He grew up witnessing disputes between rival aristocratic families, conflicts between secular rulers in the church, and struggles for influence that stretched across the continent. These experiences helped shape the qualities that would later define his reign. Unlike many rulers who relied solely on force, Frederick possessed a rare combination of determination, charisma, strategic intelligence, and political adaptability. He understood that lasting authority required more than military victories. It demanded diplomacy, negotiation, and the ability to unite competing interests under a common vision. These talents would prove invaluable as he rose to power in one of the largest and most challenging political entities in Europe, the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire was vast in size, but difficult to govern. It stretched across much of Central Europe, encompassing territories that now form parts of Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Italy, the Czech Republic, Belgium, the Netherlands, and other regions. Yet despite its impressive scale, the empire was far from a centralized state. Local princes, dukes, bishops, and nobles possessed significant autonomy and frequently resisted attempts by emperors to strengthen central authority. Every ruler who sought to unify the empire faced enormous obstacles. Frederick understood these challenges better than most. In 1152, following the death of his uncle, King Conrad III, Frederick was elected King of Germany. The election marked the beginning of a remarkable political career. From the moment he assumed power, he demonstrated an ambitious vision for restoring imperial prestige and strengthening the authority of the crown. He sought not merely to rule, but to revive the glory associated with earlier emperors who had dominated European politics. 3 years later, in 1155, Frederick traveled to Rome, where he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope. The ceremony elevated him to one of the most powerful positions in Christendom. As emperor, Frederick claimed authority that extended beyond Germany and into the broader political landscape of Europe. Yet the title also carried immense responsibilities and expectations. Maintaining control over such a diverse collection of territories required constant effort, and challenges emerged from nearly every direction. One of the most significant struggles of Frederick's reign centered on northern Italy. During the 12th century, the region was home to wealthy and increasingly independent city-states such as Milan, Cremona, Piacenza, and others. These cities prospered through trade, commerce, and manufacturing, accumulating wealth that allowed them to challenge imperial authority. Frederick viewed their growing independence as a direct threat to imperial power. Determined to reassert control, he launched multiple military campaigns into Italy. The Italian campaigns became some of the defining events of Frederick's reign. At times, he achieved impressive victories. Cities were besieged, rebellious leaders were punished, and imperial authority appeared secure. Yet resistance proved remarkably resilient. The wealthy communes of northern Italy formed alliances, raised armies, and repeatedly challenged imperial intervention. The conflict eventually culminated in the formation of the Lombard League, a coalition of city-states united against Frederick's ambitions. The struggle reached a decisive turning point in 1176 at the Battle of Legnano. There, Frederick suffered one of the most significant defeats of his career. His forces were unable to break the resistance of the Lombard League, forcing him to reconsider his strategy. Rather than continuing a costly and potentially endless war, Frederick demonstrated the pragmatism that often distinguished successful rulers. Through negotiation and compromise, he reached agreements that preserved imperial prestige while recognizing certain local freedoms. The outcome revealed one of the most important aspects of his leadership. He was a warrior, but he was also a realist. He understood when diplomacy could achieve what armies could not. Frederick's reign was shaped not only by conflicts with secular rivals, but also by tensions with the Church. Relations between emperors and popes had long been complicated. Both institutions claimed universal authority, and their interests frequently collided. During Frederick's rule, disputes emerged over appointments, political influence, and the balance of power within Christendom. Several confrontations with the papacy tested his leadership and forced him to navigate one of the most delicate political relationships of the medieval world. Despite these challenges, Frederick consistently maintained his position as one of Europe's dominant rulers. His ability to survive political crises enhanced his reputation and strengthened his authority. Throughout his nearly 40-year reign, he faced dangers that would have overwhelmed many lesser leaders. Rebellions erupted within the empire. Rival nobles challenged his decisions. Military campaigns drained resources and tested loyalty. Diplomatic disputes threatened alliances. Religious controversies created additional pressures. Yet time and again, Frederick adapted and endured. His resilience became one of the defining characteristics of his rule. As the years passed, his reputation spread across Europe. Supporters viewed him as the embodiment of imperial strength and stability. To many Germans, he represented the restoration of order and prestige. Chroniclers praised his leadership, determination, and commitment to the empire. Even opponents often respected his capabilities. His distinctive red beard contributed to his legendary status. The nickname Barbarossa, meaning red beard in Italian, became synonymous with imperial authority. Over time, the name acquired an almost mythical quality. Stories about his achievements circulated throughout Europe, reinforcing his image as a ruler of exceptional stature. Legends would later emerge claiming that Barbarossa had not truly died, but merely slept beneath a mountain, waiting to return in Germany's hour of greatest need. Such myths reflected the profound impression he left upon the medieval imagination. By the late 12th century, Frederick had become more than a ruler. He had become a symbol of imperial greatness, admired across much of Europe and feared by those who opposed him. By the late 12th century, Frederick had reached an age when many rulers would have considered retirement or a reduced role in public affairs. Instead, he remained actively engaged in the great events of his time. The political landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean was once again drawing the attention of Europe. In 1187, the Muslim leader Saladin achieved a stunning victory at the Battle of Hattin and subsequently captured Jerusalem, one of Christianity's holiest cities. News of Jerusalem's fall shocked Christendom. Calls for a new crusade spread rapidly across Europe. The response became known as the Third Crusade, one of the most famous military expeditions of the Middle Ages. 3 of Europe's most powerful rulers answered the call: Richard I of England, Philip II of France, and Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. Among them, Frederick was the oldest and most experienced. He possessed decades of military leadership and commanded enormous respect throughout Europe. Many contemporaries believed that his participation would significantly increase the chances of success. In 1189, Frederick began assembling a massive crusading army. Estimates vary, but many sources suggest that tens of thousands of soldiers joined the expedition. The force included knights, infantry, nobles, clergy, and support personnel drawn from across the empire. It was one of the largest armies ever organized for a crusade. Unlike some previous crusading expeditions that relied heavily on sea transport, Frederick chose to lead his forces overland through Central Europe, the Balkans, and Anatolia. The journey was long, difficult, and filled with challenges. Negotiations with foreign rulers were required to secure safe passage. Supply lines had to be maintained across vast distances. Harsh weather, disease, and logistical problems constantly threatened progress. Yet, despite these obstacles, Frederick's army advanced steadily toward the Holy Land. His leadership inspired confidence among his followers. Even in his late 60s, he remained an active and determined commander. Every successful stage of the journey reinforced the belief that the emperor might achieve something extraordinary. The prospect of Frederick Barbarossa arriving in the Holy Land at the head of such a powerful army alarmed his enemies and encouraged his allies. His reputation alone carried enormous weight. He had spent decades overcoming challenges that would have defeated weaker men. He had survived wars, rebellions, diplomatic crises, and political rivalries. He had endured setbacks and emerged stronger. Few leaders in Europe possessed comparable experience. To many observers, Frederick appeared almost unstoppable. Yet history often turns on moments no one anticipates. The greatest dangers do not always emerge from enemy armies, political conspiracies, or dramatic battles. Sometimes they arise from the most ordinary circumstances imaginable. After a lifetime spent confronting kings, popes, rebels, and rival commanders, Frederick Barbarossa was approaching the climax of his final great journey. Ahead lay the Holy Land and the promise of one last campaign that could secure his place among the greatest crusading leaders in history. But fate had prepared a very different ending. The enemy that would ultimately defeat the mighty emperor was not a sword, a siege, or a battlefield. It was a river. In 1187, a piece of news spread across Europe that stunned kings, nobles, clergy, and ordinary believers alike. Jerusalem, the sacred city that stood at the heart of Christian devotion, had fallen to Muslim forces led by the brilliant commander Saladin. For nearly a century, the Crusader states, established during the First Crusade, had maintained a fragile foothold in the Holy Land. Despite constant warfare, shifting alliances, and periods of instability, many Christians had come to believe that Jerusalem would remain under their control. That assumption shattered after the catastrophic Battle of Hattin in July 1187. There, Saladin's forces decisively defeated the Kingdom of Jerusalem's army, capturing many of its leading nobles and military commanders. The defeat was one of the greatest disasters in Crusader history. With the kingdom's defenses broken, city after city fell into Muslim hands. Before long, Jerusalem itself surrendered. Across Christendom, the loss was perceived not merely as a military setback, but as a spiritual catastrophe. The city contained sites associated with the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. To medieval Europeans, its capture represented a profound challenge to Christian prestige and authority. Reports of the defeat spread rapidly along trade routes, through monasteries, royal courts, and churches. Chroniclers described widespread shock and grief. Many feared that the entire Crusader presence in the Holy Land was on the verge of collapse. The reaction was swift. Pope Gregory VIII issued a call for a new crusade, urging Christian rulers to set aside their rivalries and unite against a common threat. His appeal echoed throughout Europe, reaching kingdoms and principalities that were often more accustomed to fighting one another than cooperating. Yet the scale of the crisis demanded an extraordinary response. What followed would become one of the most ambitious military enterprises of the medieval era. For the first time in generations, 3 of Europe's most powerful monarchs committed themselves to the same crusading effort. Among them were King Richard I of England, later celebrated as Richard the Lionheart, King Philip II of France, one of the most capable rulers of his age, and Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, the veteran ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. Together, these men commanded enormous resources and represented the political and military strength of Western Christendom. Their participation transformed the new expedition into a crusade unlike any that had come before it. The prospect of 3 such powerful leaders converging on the Holy Land generated enormous expectations. Many contemporaries believed that the combined might of England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire would inevitably reverse Saladin's victories and restore Christian control over Jerusalem. Yet among the 3 rulers, Frederick Barbarossa stood apart in several important respects. He was by far the oldest and also the most experienced. While Richard and Philip were energetic and ambitious monarchs still building their reputations, Frederick had already spent nearly 4 decades ruling one of Europe's largest political entities. He had survived rebellions, defeated rivals, negotiated with popes, campaigned across Italy, and maintained authority over a vast and often turbulent empire. By the late 12th century, his name was known throughout Europe. Supporters viewed Frederick Barbarossa as the embodiment of imperial power. Even his opponents respected his abilities. To many observers, he appeared uniquely qualified to lead a campaign of such enormous complexity. His reputation alone inspired confidence. Moreover, the Holy Roman Empire possessed resources on a scale few states could match. Its territories stretched across much of Central Europe and contained countless nobles capable of raising troops for the crusading cause. When Frederick announced his intention to join the expedition, thousands responded. Princes pledged support. Knights prepared their equipment. Clergy preached the importance of the mission. Organizing such an undertaking required extraordinary administrative skill. Medieval armies were difficult to maintain even during short campaigns close to home. The crusade would require moving tens of thousands of people across thousands of miles of unfamiliar territory. Supplies had to be gathered, transportation arranged, diplomatic agreements negotiated, routes planned. Every stage of the journey involved challenges that could derail the expedition before it even reached its destination. Yet Frederick's long experience as a ruler allowed him to approach these problems with remarkable efficiency. Preparations continued throughout 1188 and into 1189. As the army assembled, its scale became increasingly apparent. Contemporary estimates vary widely, and medieval chroniclers often exaggerated numbers, but there is little doubt that Frederick commanded one of the largest crusading forces ever organized. Thousands of armored knights joined the expedition. Infantry soldiers arrived from across the empire. Engineers, craftsmen, clergy, servants, merchants, and camp followers accompanied the army. Wagons loaded with supplies stretched across the landscape. Horses, pack animals, weapons, food, tents, and equipment were gathered in enormous quantities. The logistical requirements were staggering. Every day required vast amounts of food and water. Every mile demanded coordination and discipline. Yet the emperor's authority helped maintain order among a force composed of men from many different regions and backgrounds. Unlike some previous crusading expeditions that relied heavily on sea travel, Frederick chose to lead his army overland. The decision carried significant risks, but also offered advantages. Sea voyages could be dangerous, expensive, and dependent upon naval support. By traveling overland, Frederick could maintain direct control over his forces throughout the journey. The route would take the army through Hungary, the Balkans, Byzantine territory, and eventually Anatolia before reaching the eastern Mediterranean. Diplomatic negotiations preceded the march. Safe passage had to be secured from rulers whose lands the Crusaders would cross. Political tensions complicated these arrangements. Not every ruler welcomed the arrival of a massive foreign army. Concerns about supply shortages, local unrest, and military confrontation were constant. Frederick spent considerable effort ensuring that the expedition could proceed without triggering unnecessary conflicts. His reputation as a seasoned statesman proved invaluable. Throughout the planning process, Frederick balanced diplomacy and military preparation with the skill that had defined his reign. Agreements were reached, routes were secured, and the enormous machinery of the crusade slowly came together. By the spring of 1189, everything was finally ready. In May, the long-awaited journey began. The crusading army set out from the empire and started its march toward the Holy Land. For many participants, the departure marked the beginning of a sacred mission that might define their lives. Some expected glory, others sought spiritual redemption. Many understood they might never return home. Crowds gathered to watch the columns move eastward. Banners fluttered in the wind. Armor gleamed beneath the sun. Priests offered blessings as thousands embarked upon one of the greatest military pilgrimages of the medieval world. The sight was extraordinary. Endless lines of soldiers, horses, wagons, and camp followers stretched across the landscape. The movement of such a vast force required constant coordination. Supplies had to be distributed. Camps had to be established each evening. Security had to be maintained. Yet, despite the immense logistical challenges, the crusading host advanced steadily. At the head of this enormous expedition rode Frederick Barbarossa himself. Nearly 70 years old, he remained an imposing figure. Although advanced age often limited medieval rulers, Frederick continued to demonstrate remarkable energy and determination. His willingness to personally lead the crusade inspired admiration among contemporaries. Many viewed his participation as proof of his commitment to the cause. He could easily have delegated command to younger nobles, but instead he chose to undertake the difficult journey himself. That decision enhanced his already legendary reputation. To the soldiers marching behind him, the emperor embodied the strength and prestige of the Holy Roman Empire. To many Europeans watching from afar, he represented the Crusade's greatest hope for success. The combination of his experience, authority, and military resources seemed to give the Christian coalition a powerful advantage. Expectations remained high as the army moved farther east. If Frederick could successfully bring his forces to the Holy Land, they would join the armies of Richard the Lionheart and Philip II, creating one of the most formidable concentrations of military power Europe had ever assembled. The prospect excited supporters and alarmed enemies alike. Saladin had achieved remarkable victories, but many believed even he would struggle against the combined strength of three great monarchs leading armies from across Christendom. As the Crusaders continued their long march toward the eastern Mediterranean, few could have imagined how dramatically events would soon change. The emperor, who had spent decades overcoming every challenge before him, appeared destined for one final great achievement. Yet history often reserves its greatest surprises for moments when success seems closest at hand. Unlike Richard and Philip, who would eventually make much of their journey by sea, Frederick Barbarossa chose the far more difficult overland route to the Holy Land. The decision reflected both his confidence and his experience as a military commander. By remaining with his army throughout the expedition, Frederick could maintain direct control over every aspect of the campaign. Yet this choice also meant facing one of the longest and most demanding military journeys of the medieval era. The crusading army would travel thousands of miles across unfamiliar lands, crossing rivers, mountains, forests, and plains before ever reaching its intended battlefield. The expedition moved through territories that today form parts of Germany, Austria, Hungary, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Turkey. At every stage, new obstacles emerged. Supplies had to be secured for tens of thousands of soldiers and animals. Diplomatic agreements had to be negotiated with rulers whose lands the Crusaders intended to cross. Roads and bridges often proved inadequate for an army of such enormous size. Even minor delays could create serious logistical problems. Despite these challenges, Frederick's reputation frequently opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. Many local rulers preferred cooperation over confrontation when faced with the arrival of the Holy Roman Emperor and his vast army. Years of political and military experience allowed Frederick to navigate situations that might have led to conflict under less capable leadership. His authority helped maintain order among soldiers drawn from many different regions of the empire. The army included nobles, knights, infantrymen, clergy, craftsmen, merchants, and countless camp followers. Keeping such a diverse force united was no simple task, yet Frederick's leadership ensured that discipline remained remarkably strong. Even in old age, he demonstrated extraordinary endurance. At nearly 70 years old, an age that few medieval rulers ever reached, he continued to ride with his troops and oversee the progress of the campaign. His determination inspired those around him. To many crusaders, the emperor seemed almost larger than life. He had spent decades surviving wars, rebellions, political crises, and rivalries. If anyone could successfully lead a crusade across half the known world, it seemed to be Frederick Barbarossa. As the army pushed farther eastward, confidence remained high. Every mile brought them closer to the Holy Land. Every obstacle overcome strengthened the belief that victory remained within reach. The journey was exhausting, but the Crusaders believed they were participating in one of the most important missions of their generation. Ahead lay Jerusalem, the sacred city whose loss had shocked Christendom only a few years earlier. Few among them could imagine that the greatest challenge of the expedition still lay ahead. The army continued its relentless march eastward, crossing difficult terrain and enduring conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. Yet, under Frederick's leadership, the Crusaders remained convinced that their sacrifices would ultimately be rewarded. As the months passed, the hardships of the journey became increasingly severe. Moving such a massive force across vast distances placed constant pressure on supplies and morale. Food shortages appeared more frequently as the army advanced farther from familiar territories. Local resources were often insufficient to support so many people and animals. Procuring enough grain, water, and livestock became a daily concern. Disease also took its toll. Long marches, poor sanitation, and harsh environmental conditions weakened many soldiers. Illness spread through portions of the camp, reducing the army's strength and placing additional burdens on commanders. Yet, despite these difficulties, the Crusaders continued forward. Frederick's determination never seemed to waver. His willingness to endure the same hardships as his men strengthened their loyalty and respect. The landscape itself often seemed to conspire against them. Mountain ranges blocked their path and forced lengthy detours. Rivers required careful planning and dangerous crossings. During the summer months, intense heat exhausted both soldiers and horses. Water became precious. Animals collapsed from fatigue. Equipment wore out from constant use. Nevertheless, the crusading host pressed onward. By early 1190, the army had entered Anatolia, a region where the campaign became significantly more dangerous. Here, the Crusaders encountered resistance from Seljuk Turkish forces determined to hinder their advance. Rather than engaging in large-scale battles, these opponents often relied on harassment tactics. Small raiding parties attacked isolated groups, disrupted supply lines, and forced the Crusaders to remain constantly alert. The psychological strain proved almost as challenging as the physical hardships. Men who had already marched thousands of miles now faced the prospect of continued attacks while operating in unfamiliar territory. Supplies grew increasingly scarce. Hunger became a constant companion for many soldiers. Some began questioning whether they would ever reach the Holy Land. Yet Frederick refused to consider retreat. For him, the crusade remained a sacred mission that had to be completed. The capture of Jerusalem by Saladin still weighed heavily on Christian Europe, and the emperor believed his army could help reverse that loss. His confidence encouraged others to persevere. Time and again, the Crusaders overcame difficulties that seemed insurmountable. Each successful stage of the journey reinforced the belief that they were destined to reach their goal. Though battered by months of marching, they continued to move steadily toward the eastern Mediterranean, convinced that the hardest challenges were behind them and that ultimate victory remained possible. The emperor's presence remained a powerful source of stability. Whenever doubts emerged, his determination reminded the army why they had embarked on the crusade in the first place. Through hunger, exhaustion, and constant danger, Frederick Barbarossa continued leading the march toward what many believed would be the crowning achievement of his remarkable life. By the spring of 1190, Frederick Barbarossa appeared closer than ever to achieving one final and extraordinary triumph. His army had survived a journey that many considered nearly impossible. It had crossed continents, navigated political tensions, endured shortages, and resisted repeated threats from hostile forces. Few rulers in medieval history had successfully led such a massive army over such immense distances. The emperor's reputation, already legendary before the crusade began, grew even stronger with every hardship overcome. To supporters, he seemed almost unstoppable. Decades of experience had taught him how to overcome adversity, and throughout his reign, he had repeatedly emerged victorious from crises that might have destroyed weaker leaders. Many crusaders believed they were witnessing the final great achievement of one of Europe's greatest rulers. The Holy Land appeared closer with every passing week. The possibility of joining forces with other crusading armies and confronting Saladin seemed increasingly realistic. Morale remained strong despite exhaustion. The dream of reclaiming Jerusalem no longer seemed distant. Yet history often turns on events that no one anticipates. Great armies prepare for battles, sieges, and enemy attacks. They rarely expect disaster to emerge from something ordinary and routine. After months of surviving dangers, both political and military, Frederick's army encountered a challenge that countless armies had faced before: crossing a river. On June 10, 1190, the Crusaders reached the Saleph River in southern Anatolia, known today as the Göksu River. River crossings were a normal part of military campaigns. Commanders routinely led armies across waterways, large and small. Although such operations required caution, they were not generally viewed as extraordinary dangers. To Frederick and his men, the crossing likely appeared to be just another obstacle on the road to Jerusalem. Yet this seemingly ordinary moment would soon become one of the most famous incidents in medieval history. Within hours, everything would change. The emperor, who had survived wars, rebellions, political intrigues, and decades of leadership, was about to face the event that would define the final chapter of his life. What occurred at the Saleph River remains one of the most debated episodes of the Third Crusade. The consequences were immediate and profound. An army numbering tens of thousands would suddenly lose its leader. The momentum of the crusade would be shattered. Across Europe, the news would spread with astonishing speed, leaving rulers and common people alike struggling to comprehend how one of Christendom's greatest rulers could meet such an unexpected fate. June 10, 1190, would become one of the most consequential days in crusading history, proving that even the mightiest leaders can be undone by the most ordinary circumstances. The crusading army's long and arduous march across Anatolia eventually brought it to the banks of the Saleph River, known today as the Göksu River in southern Turkey. By this stage of the expedition, the soldiers had endured hardships that few armies in medieval history could match. For months, they had crossed rugged mountain ranges, traversed hostile territory, endured shortages of food and water, and marched beneath an unforgiving summer sun. Fatigue had become a constant companion. Horses showed signs of exhaustion. Supplies were stretched thin. Illness and hunger had affected many within the ranks. Yet, despite these challenges, morale remained surprisingly resilient. The Holy Land seemed closer than ever before. Every mile carried the Crusaders nearer to Jerusalem, the sacred city whose loss had inspired the entire campaign. Many believed the most difficult stages of the journey were finally behind them. The river before them appeared to be little more than another obstacle on the road ahead. Throughout history, armies had crossed countless rivers during military campaigns. Such operations required caution and organization, but they were rarely viewed as extraordinary dangers. To Frederick Barbarossa and his men, the Saleph River likely seemed routine. The weather on June 10, 1190, was particularly hot. The Anatolian sun had made the day's march exhausting, and many soldiers welcomed the sight of fresh water. For weary travelers, the river offered more than a crossing point. It provided relief from oppressive heat and an opportunity to refresh both men and animals after weeks of difficult travel. Few could have imagined that this ordinary moment would soon become one of the most famous and tragic episodes in medieval history. Yet, despite the significance of what followed, historians still cannot determine with complete certainty exactly how Frederick Barbarossa died. The surviving sources were written by different chroniclers, often relying on second-hand reports gathered after the event. As a result, the accounts frequently contradict one another. Some writers claimed that the emperor entered the river voluntarily to cool himself after the exhausting march. Others suggested that he was attempting to swim across. Several accounts describe him crossing on horseback when disaster struck unexpectedly. A few chroniclers even reported that his horse lost its footing in the water, throwing the elderly emperor into the current. Other sources focus less on the precise circumstances and more on the environmental conditions surrounding the crossing. The details vary, but every version shares one common theme: the suddenness of the tragedy. One moment Frederick was leading one of the largest crusading armies ever assembled. The next, something had gone terribly wrong. No enemy attack occurred. No battle erupted. There was no warning of the catastrophe about to unfold. The emperor, who had spent decades overcoming challenges that would have destroyed lesser rulers, was suddenly facing a danger no one had anticipated. What began as an ordinary river crossing was about to become a turning point in the history of the Crusades. Although the exact details remain uncertain, a broad outline of events can be reconstructed from the available evidence. At some point during the crossing, Frederick entered the river. Whether by choice or accident remains a matter of debate, but it quickly became apparent that he was in serious difficulty. Witnesses reportedly observed signs of distress almost immediately. Despite the presence of soldiers nearby, events unfolded with alarming speed. The emperor disappeared beneath the surface. Confusion spread among those watching from the riverbank. What had seemed like a routine crossing suddenly became an emergency. Panic erupted throughout the surrounding area. Men rushed forward to help their ruler. Commands were shouted. Some attempted to enter the water. Others searched desperately for a way to reach him before the current carried him away. Yet, despite these efforts, the rescue failed. By the time Frederick was recovered from the river, he was dead. The shock that followed was immense. Only moments earlier, the emperor had stood at the head of the expedition. He was the leader whose authority had guided the crusading host across continents. He was the ruler whose reputation had inspired thousands to take the cross and march toward Jerusalem. Now he was gone. The Holy Roman Emperor, one of the most powerful figures in Europe, had died not on a battlefield or during a dramatic siege, but during what should have been an ordinary river crossing. For many soldiers, the reality was almost impossible to comprehend. Frederick had survived decades of warfare, political intrigue, rebellions, diplomatic crises, and religious conflicts. He had defeated powerful enemies, outlived rivals, and overcome challenges that would have destroyed many rulers. The idea that such a man could perish in a river seemed unbelievable. Yet there could be no doubt about the outcome. The crusade had lost its leader. News of the emperor's death spread rapidly through the camp. Shock soon gave way to uncertainty as nobles, commanders, and clergy struggled to understand the implications of what had happened. Questions emerged immediately. How could such an experienced leader die under circumstances that appeared so ordinary? Could the tragedy have been prevented? Had the emperor suffered some kind of medical emergency? Was the current stronger than it appeared? The answers remained elusive. Rumors circulated among the soldiers. Different explanations competed for acceptance. Some interpreted the event as a terrible accident. Others viewed it through a religious lens, wondering whether divine intervention had played a role. Regardless of the explanation, the psychological impact was devastating. The army that had marched across Europe under Frederick's leadership suddenly found itself without the man who had united and inspired it. One of the most enduring mysteries surrounding Frederick Barbarossa's death concerns the depth of the water and the precise cause of the drowning. Over the centuries, countless readers have been fascinated by reports suggesting that portions of the Saleph River were not especially deep. Some descriptions imply that the water may have been shallow enough for a man to stand in certain areas. Such details naturally raise questions. How could one of Europe's most powerful rulers drown in a river that may not have been particularly deep? Yet modern experts emphasize that rivers can be deceptively dangerous even when they appear harmless. Depth alone does not determine risk. Strong currents can sweep a person off balance with surprising force. Uneven riverbeds can create sudden hazards beneath the surface. Cold water can trigger shock, particularly in individuals who are already physically exhausted. Heavy clothing can become waterlogged and difficult to manage within seconds. If Frederick entered the river wearing armor or thick garments, the added weight could have significantly reduced his ability to move or recover from a fall. His age may also have been an important factor. At nearly 70 years old, Frederick was already remarkable simply for participating in such a demanding campaign. Most people in the medieval world never reached such an age, let alone undertook a military expedition across continents. Months of marching through difficult terrain had undoubtedly taken a physical toll. Exhaustion, dehydration, intense heat, and accumulated fatigue may have left him vulnerable. Some historians have even suggested that he may have suffered a heart attack, stroke, or other medical emergency before drowning. Although such theories cannot be proven, they remain plausible given the circumstances. Most modern scholars believe that no single factor fully explains the tragedy. Instead, several conditions likely combined to create a fatal situation. Age, exhaustion, environmental conditions, strong currents, heavy clothing, and simple bad luck may all have played a role. What remains beyond dispute is the outcome. Frederick Barbarossa's body was eventually recovered from the river, but by then the damage had already been done. The emperor was dead, and with him vanished the central figure holding together one of the largest crusading armies ever assembled. The consequences would soon ripple throughout the entire expedition. What appeared at first to be a tragic accident would become one of the defining moments of the Third Crusade. An army that had crossed half the known world under Frederick's leadership suddenly found itself without its commander. Morale would suffer. Discipline would weaken. Thousands would abandon the campaign. The struggle for the Holy Land would continue, but under dramatically different circumstances. In that sense, the events at the Saleph River were far more than a personal tragedy. They became a turning point in medieval history, reshaping the fate of an army, altering the course of a crusade, and changing the balance of power in the struggle between Christian and Muslim forces in the Eastern Mediterranean. The death of Frederick Barbarossa sent shockwaves through the crusading army. One moment, the expedition possessed one of the most respected and experienced leaders in Europe. The next, that leader was gone. The consequences were immediate. For months, the army had relied heavily upon Frederick's authority, experience, and reputation. He had served not only as commander, but also as the unifying force that held together thousands of soldiers from different regions, backgrounds, and noble families. His presence inspired confidence and discipline. His decisions guided the army through political disputes, logistical challenges, and military dangers. Without him, uncertainty spread rapidly through the camp. News of the emperor's death moved from soldier to soldier, creating disbelief and confusion. Many struggled to accept that a ruler who had survived decades of warfare and political turmoil could perish so suddenly in a river crossing. The shock was intensified by the circumstances. Had Frederick fallen gloriously in battle, his followers might have viewed his death differently. Instead, the unexpected nature of the tragedy left many searching for explanations. Medieval society often interpreted major events through a religious lens, and countless crusaders viewed the emperor's death as more than an accident. Some believed it represented a divine warning. Others feared it signaled God's disapproval of the expedition. Such interpretations spread quickly among men already exhausted by months of hardship. Morale, which had remained surprisingly resilient throughout the difficult march across Anatolia, suddenly began to collapse. Confidence gave way to doubt. Soldiers who had once believed they were destined to reach Jerusalem now questioned whether the crusade could succeed at all. Rumors circulated throughout the camp. Anxiety grew. The sense of purpose that had sustained the army during its long journey began to weaken. For many participants, Frederick's death felt like a turning point from which the expedition might never recover. The psychological impact alone was devastating. Armies can survive shortages, difficult terrain, and enemy attacks, but the sudden loss of a trusted leader often creates problems that are far more difficult to overcome. As uncertainty spread through the crusading host, officers and nobles faced the enormous challenge of preventing complete disintegration. They worked tirelessly to preserve order, maintain discipline, and reassure frightened soldiers that the mission could still succeed. Yet every effort was overshadowed by the absence of the man who had led them across half the known world. The future of the expedition suddenly appeared far less certain than it had only days before. What had once seemed an unstoppable march toward Jerusalem now felt fragile and unpredictable, balanced precariously between perseverance and collapse. Responsibility for maintaining order now fell largely upon Frederick's son, Duke Frederick of Swabia. He inherited an almost impossible task. Although capable and respected, he lacked the authority, prestige, and decades of experience that had made his father such a formidable leader. No one could simply replace Frederick Barbarossa. For nearly 40 years, the emperor had stood among the dominant figures of European politics. His reputation extended far beyond the boundaries of the Holy Roman Empire. Kings respected him, nobles feared him, soldiers trusted him. The younger Frederick faced the challenge of leading an army that had lost not only its commander but also much of its confidence. Nevertheless, he attempted to preserve discipline and continue the mission. The crusading army pressed onward toward the Holy Land, but it was no longer the same force that had marched proudly from Europe. The psychological blow inflicted by the emperor's death had lasting consequences. Desertions increased as some soldiers lost faith in the expedition's chances of success. Others simply wished to return home rather than continue a journey that now seemed increasingly uncertain. Disease, already a persistent problem during the march, continued to spread through the ranks. Exhaustion accumulated after months of campaigning. Supplies became more difficult to secure. Every challenge that Frederick had previously managed now seemed more difficult to overcome. The army's numbers steadily declined. Men who had survived countless hardships during the journey now abandoned the crusade or succumbed to illness and fatigue. The once massive host that had crossed Europe and Anatolia began to shrink dramatically. Each week brought further losses. The momentum that had carried the Crusaders eastward under Barbarossa's leadership gradually faded. Although the expedition continued, its character had fundamentally changed. The sense of unity and confidence that had defined the army during the emperor's lifetime was gone. Those who remained continued marching because they believed in the crusading cause, but many recognized that the expedition had lost something irreplaceable. What had once been Europe's most formidable crusading army was slowly becoming a shadow of its former self. The consequences of Frederick's death were no longer confined to a single river crossing. They were reshaping the entire future of the campaign. Every mile traveled after the emperor's death served as a reminder of what had been lost. The Crusaders still moved toward their objective, but they did so burdened by uncertainty, weakened by attrition, and deprived of the leader whose presence had once made victory seem inevitable. By the time the surviving Crusaders finally reached the eastern Mediterranean, only a fraction of the original army remained. The enormous force that had departed Europe under Frederick Barbarossa's leadership had been reduced by desertion, disease, exhaustion, and the countless hardships of the journey. Although some troops eventually joined other crusading forces operating in the region, the loss of manpower was immense. More importantly, the loss of leadership could never be fully replaced. The Third Crusade would continue under the command of other great rulers. Richard the Lionheart of England would emerge as one of the most celebrated military leaders of the medieval world, winning a series of impressive victories against Saladin and demonstrating extraordinary skill on the battlefield. Philip II of France also participated in the campaign, though his role would prove more limited. Together, these leaders achieved important successes and helped preserve portions of the Crusader presence in the Eastern Mediterranean. Yet, despite their accomplishments, the ultimate objective remained unfulfilled. Jerusalem was never recaptured. Negotiations, battles, and campaigns altered the balance of power, but the Holy City remained under Muslim control. Historians have long debated whether the outcome might have been different had Frederick Barbarossa survived. Such questions can never be answered with certainty. History offers no opportunity to test alternate possibilities. Nevertheless, the scale of Frederick's army and the respect he commanded make the speculation understandable. Had he reached the Holy Land at the head of tens of thousands of experienced soldiers, the military and political situation could have been dramatically altered. His presence might have strengthened Crusader operations, increased pressure on Saladin, and provided a level of unity among Christian forces that often proved difficult to achieve. Whether these advantages would have been sufficient to retake Jerusalem remains impossible to know. What is certain is that Frederick's death weakened the Christian cause at a critical moment. The loss deprived the crusade of one of its strongest leaders before a single major battle in the Holy Land had been fought. More than 8 centuries later, historians continue to view the drowning of Frederick Barbarossa as one of the most consequential accidents of the Middle Ages. A single moment in a river transformed the fate of an army, altered the course of a crusade, and changed the history of the medieval world. Few events illustrate more clearly how the destiny of nations can be shaped not only by battles and kings, but also by sudden and unexpected moments that alter the course of history forever. Centuries later, historians continue to debate the exact circumstances surrounding the death of Frederick Barbarossa. Despite the importance of the event, the surviving accounts are frustratingly inconsistent. Medieval chroniclers often relied on eyewitness testimony that had passed through multiple retellings before being recorded. As stories spread across Europe, details changed, interpretations evolved, and contradictions emerged. Some sources claim that Frederick entered the Saleph River voluntarily in an attempt to cool himself from the oppressive Anatolian heat. After months of marching through difficult terrain beneath the summer sun, such a decision would not have been unusual. Other accounts suggest that he was not bathing at all, but merely attempting a routine river crossing as part of the army's advance. Several chroniclers describe the emperor crossing on horseback when something suddenly went wrong. Because the available sources disagree on fundamental details, historians have never been able to establish a definitive account of the incident. Every version contains uncertainties. Every explanation leaves unanswered questions. Frederick was not an ordinary traveler. He was the Holy Roman Emperor, one of the most powerful rulers in Europe, and the leader of one of the largest crusading armies ever assembled. The circumstances of his death therefore attracted enormous attention, both during his lifetime and long afterward. Chroniclers sought explanations that could make sense of such an unexpected tragedy. Some emphasized the dangers of the river itself. Others focused on the emperor's physical condition. Still others interpreted the event through a religious lens, viewing it as part of a larger divine plan. Over time, these competing interpretations became woven into the historical record, creating a mystery that has endured for more than 8 centuries. Although modern historians possess more analytical tools than medieval chroniclers, they remain constrained by the same limited evidence. The precise sequence of events that unfolded on June 10, 1190, may never be known with complete certainty. What remains clear is that something occurred during that crossing that transformed an ordinary day of marching into one of the most consequential moments in crusading history. The mystery itself has become part of Frederick's legacy. Historians continue to revisit the available evidence, compare contemporary accounts, and search for clues hidden within surviving chronicles. Yet, despite generations of scholarship, the final moments of the emperor's life remain obscured by uncertainty. The event stands as a reminder of how even major turning points in history can leave behind incomplete and contradictory records, forcing later generations to piece together the past from fragments that never tell the entire story. Among the many theories surrounding Frederick's death, some focus on the possibility that drowning may not have been the only factor involved. A number of historians have suggested that the elderly emperor may have suffered a medical emergency before entering the water or while attempting to cross it. At nearly 70 years old, Frederick was undertaking one of the most physically demanding journeys of his life. Even by modern standards, the expedition would have been exhausting. By medieval standards, it was extraordinary. Months of travel through difficult terrain had subjected him to intense heat, physical strain, dehydration, and constant stress. Some scholars have therefore proposed that he may have experienced a heart attack, stroke, or another sudden medical crisis that left him unable to save himself once he entered the river. Such explanations are impossible to prove, but they remain plausible given his age and circumstances. Regardless of the specific cause, what is beyond dispute is that Frederick was operating under extreme conditions. Modern observers sometimes overlook just how demanding the crusading journey had become by the summer of 1190. The army had crossed continents. Supplies had often been limited. Sleep was frequently inadequate. Disease circulated among the troops. The emperor had endured the same hardships as many of his soldiers while continuing to carry the immense responsibilities of command. Even a relatively minor accident could have become deadly under such circumstances. A stumble, a moment of dizziness, or a brief loss of balance might have been enough to trigger disaster. Age alone may have played a critical role. While Frederick remained remarkably active for a man of nearly 70, the physical realities of aging cannot be ignored. Reflexes slow. Strength declines. Recovery from exertion becomes more difficult. Combined with exhaustion and environmental stress, these factors may have significantly increased his vulnerability. Whether he suffered a medical emergency, lost his footing, or simply found himself overwhelmed by conditions in the river, the result was the same. Within moments, one of Europe's most accomplished rulers was struggling for his life. The fact that such a powerful and experienced leader could be defeated by circumstances that appear so ordinary continues to fascinate historians and readers alike. It serves as a reminder that even the greatest figures in history remain subject to the same physical limitations as everyone else. No amount of authority, military success, or political influence could exempt Frederick from the realities of age and human frailty. The emperor, who had spent decades shaping the destiny of kingdoms, was ultimately vulnerable to the same hazards faced by any traveler confronting exhaustion, heat, and the unpredictable forces of nature. That contrast between immense power and human vulnerability remains one of the most compelling aspects of the story. Modern readers are often surprised by the idea that a river crossing could prove fatal, particularly if parts of the river were relatively shallow. Yet experts on water safety point out that shallow water does not guarantee protection from danger. Rivers are dynamic environments, and their risks are often underestimated. Strong currents can knock a person off balance with surprising force, especially when footing is uncertain. Uneven riverbeds, submerged rocks, and sudden changes in depth can create hazards that are difficult to detect. Clothing presents another major danger. Heavy garments absorb water rapidly, becoming difficult to move in and dramatically increasing the effort required to stay afloat. If Frederick entered the river wearing thick clothing or any form of armor, the added weight could have been devastating. Panic also plays a significant role in many drowning incidents. Even experienced swimmers can become disoriented when confronted with unexpected currents or physical distress. Once panic sets in, rational decision-making often becomes difficult. The Saleph River may have appeared harmless to many members of the crusading army. After all, river crossings were routine features of military campaigns. Soldiers had crossed countless waterways throughout the journey. Yet on June 10, 1190, this particular river proved deadly. Whether the emperor was overcome by exhaustion, struck by a medical emergency, caught by a strong current, burdened by heavy clothing, or affected by several factors simultaneously remains uncertain. Historians continue to debate the exact mechanism of his death because the evidence is incomplete and contradictory. What they do not debate is the significance of the outcome. The death of Frederick Barbarossa altered the course of the Third Crusade and weakened one of the most powerful military expeditions ever sent to the Holy Land. The emperor's final moments remain shrouded in mystery, but the consequences of those moments are unmistakable. A single incident in a river ended the life of one of medieval Europe's greatest rulers, transformed the fate of an army, and left a lasting mark on the history of the Crusades. More than 8 centuries later, the debate continues, not because historians expect to uncover a definitive answer, but because the event represents a rare intersection of mystery and consequence. The exact cause of Frederick's death may never be known, yet its impact is impossible to deny. An emperor vanished, a crusade weakened, and the course of history shifted. In that sense, the Saleph River became far more than a geographical landmark. It became the setting for one of the most consequential accidents of the Middle Ages, a place where uncertainty surrounds the details but not the significance of what occurred there. History often turns on great battles that reshape nations and redefine the balance of power. At other times, it turns on speeches that inspire movements or decisions made by rulers whose choices alter the course of entire civilizations. Historians frequently focus on these dramatic moments because they appear to provide clear explanations for why events unfolded as they did. Yet history is not always driven by grand strategy or deliberate action. Sometimes the future changes because of chance. A storm destroys a fleet. An illness claims a leader at a critical moment. A single accident removes a figure whose presence might have altered everything that followed. The death of Frederick Barbarossa belongs firmly within that category. Few events in medieval history demonstrate so clearly how a seemingly ordinary incident can produce extraordinary consequences. On June 10, 1190, the Holy Roman Emperor was not fighting a battle or negotiating a treaty. He was crossing a river, Within moments, one of the most powerful rulers in Christendom was dead. The loss was not merely personal. It was political, military, and strategic. Frederick had spent nearly 40 years building his reputation as one of Europe's most capable leaders. He commanded immense respect among allies and enemies alike. His authority extended across a vast empire, and his participation in the Third Crusade had inspired thousands to join the campaign. By the time his army reached Anatolia, it had already overcome obstacles that would have defeated many expeditions. Despite shortages, hostile territory, and months of hardship, the Crusaders continued moving forward under his leadership. The emperor's presence provided stability and confidence. His death removed that stabilizing force instantly. No enemy army had achieved what the river accomplished in a matter of moments. The consequences were felt throughout the crusading host. Morale collapsed. Discipline weakened. Desertions increased. The enormous force that had crossed Europe under Barbarossa's command gradually diminished. A campaign that had once seemed filled with possibility suddenly faced uncertainty. The accident transformed not only the fate of one man, but also the prospects of an entire military expedition. Historians continue to study the event because it illustrates how fragile even the grandest historical undertakings can be. The Third Crusade did not fail because of a decisive defeat on the battlefield. In many ways, its future began to change beside a riverbank in southern Anatolia when a single accident removed one of its most important leaders. The story serves as a powerful reminder that history is often shaped not only by victories and defeats, but also by unexpected moments that no strategist could predict and no army could fully prepare to overcome. Speculation about what might have happened had Frederick survived has fascinated historians for centuries. Such questions can never be answered with certainty, yet they remain difficult to ignore. By 1190, Barbarossa was leading one of the largest and most experienced crusading armies ever assembled. Although losses had occurred during the journey, a substantial force still accompanied him. Had he reached the Holy Land, his arrival would almost certainly have altered the strategic situation facing both the Crusaders and Saladin. Frederick possessed qualities that were often lacking among crusading leaders. He had decades of military experience, a reputation for pragmatic decision-making, and the authority necessary to command respect from rival factions. One of the recurring challenges of the Crusades was the difficulty of maintaining unity among Christian leaders whose political interests frequently conflicted. Kings, princes, nobles, and military orders often disagreed over strategy, priorities, and leadership. Frederick's stature may have helped reduce some of those divisions. As Holy Roman Emperor, he occupied a position that commanded prestige across Europe. His authority might have provided a stronger framework for cooperation among crusading forces. Militarily, his contribution could also have been significant. Saladin was an exceptionally capable commander, but even he would have needed to consider the arrival of a large imperial army led by one of Europe's most experienced rulers. Additional manpower, resources, and leadership might have strengthened Crusader operations and increased pressure on Muslim forces throughout the region. Some historians have suggested that the combined presence of Frederick, Richard the Lionheart, and Philip II could have created a military coalition unlike any seen before in the Crusades. Whether such a coalition would have succeeded in recapturing Jerusalem remains impossible to know. Success in medieval warfare depended upon countless factors, many of which could not be controlled. Nevertheless, it is difficult to deny that Frederick's survival would have given the Crusaders additional opportunities. His death removed those possibilities before they could be tested. The strategic calculations of both sides changed immediately. The emperor's army weakened, its numbers declined. Its influence diminished. Saladin no longer faced the prospect of confronting Frederick Barbarossa in the Holy Land. History moved forward along a different path, one shaped not by a deliberate decision, but by an unexpected tragedy. The unanswered question of what might have happened continues to capture the imagination because it highlights just how much depended upon the survival of a single individual at a critical moment in one of the most important conflicts of the world. Medieval era. What makes Frederick Barbarossa's death so remarkable is not merely the mystery surrounding its circumstances, but the scale of its consequences. Countless rulers have died unexpectedly throughout history. Few, however, have altered events so dramatically through their absence. The emperor's death did not end the Third Crusade. Richard the Lionheart would go on to win important victories and establish himself as one of the most famous military leaders of the medieval world. Crusader forces achieved notable successes and preserved parts of their position in the eastern Mediterranean. Yet the ultimate objective remained unfulfilled. Jerusalem was not retaken. The political and military landscape that emerged after the Crusade reflected a reality shaped in part by Frederick's absence. Historians continue to view his death as one of the most consequential accidents of the Middle Ages because it demonstrates how a single moment can redirect the course of events. The emperor vanished, an army fragmented, a crusade weakened, the balance of possibilities shifted. More than 8 centuries later, the story still captures the imagination because it combines mystery, tragedy, and historical significance in equal measure. Frederick Barbarossa survived decades of warfare, rebellions, diplomatic struggles, and political rivalries. He overcame challenges that would have destroyed many lesser rulers. His reputation became legendary during his lifetime and only grew after his death. Yet the event that ended his life was not a glorious battle or a dramatic confrontation with a powerful enemy. It was a river crossing. The contrast remains striking. One of the most powerful men in the medieval world, a ruler whose decisions influenced millions and whose armies marched across continents, was ultimately defeated by circumstances that seemed almost ordinary. That irony helps explain why his story continues to endure. History remembers great victories and famous battles, but it also remembers the moments when chance intervenes. Frederick Barbarossa's death stands as one of the clearest examples of how a single, unexpected event can change the destiny of armies, nations, and entire eras. On June 10, 1190, an emperor entered a river and never emerged alive. The details remain debated. The mystery remains unsolved. Yet the consequences are unmistakable. A crusade lost one of its strongest leaders. An army lost its guiding force. And history itself took a different path. Few accidents have carried such profound implications, and few stories illustrate more clearly how fragile the course of history can be when everything depends upon the survival of one extraordinary individual. On June 10, 1190, one of Europe's greatest rulers entered a river, and moments later, he was dead. The exact details of what happened that day remain uncertain. Medieval accounts conflict. Historians continue to debate the circumstances, and the mystery has never been fully resolved. Yet, while the cause of Frederick Barbarossa's death remains a subject of discussion, its consequences are unmistakable. For nearly 4 decades, the Holy Roman Emperor had survived wars, rebellions, political intrigues, religious conflicts, and military campaigns across Europe. He had defeated powerful rivals, commanded vast armies, and ruled one of the largest political entities in Christendom. His reputation as a leader seemed almost unshakable. Yet during what should have been an ordinary river crossing on the march to the Holy Land, everything came to an abrupt end. His sudden death shattered the momentum of the Third Crusade, weakened one of the most formidable armies Europe had ever assembled, and altered the course of medieval history. Frederick's story serves as a powerful reminder of one of history's most enduring truths. The fate of nations and empires can hinge upon the smallest and most unexpected moments. A missed opportunity, a sudden storm, a single accident, or a routine river crossing can change the destiny of countless lives. For Frederick Barbarossa, it was the final journey he would ever make. And for the Third Crusade, it became the turning point that changed everything forever.